I don't remember when I started to study the Syrian Revolution in detail. I do know that in its early years, I accepted without question what I was told by mainstream sources on the left. I had a fairly typical perspective. Assad, for all his faults, was a secular leader of a progressive pan-Arab nationalism inherited from figures like Nasser, and his regime was the last stand against the poisonous ISIS-like religious extremism that plagued Syria. However, as I delved deeper into the issue and listened to the narratives of Syrian activists in a life-and-death struggle against the regime, a very different picture began to emerge. I learned that despite Assad's secular credentials, he had released prominent members of ISIS from prison when the revolution broke out. This move was meant to poison the revolution with religious fundamentalism. But more importantly, it was to legitimize his bombing and massacre of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, so that he could cover up his tyrannical rule with the rhetoric of a war against Muslim extremism. Now, where have we heard this before? In the radical left in the West, there were very few people who heard the voices of the Syrian people and really tried to understand the history of the revolution. One of them was my friend and comrade Louis Proyect. A true Marxist, Proyect put the right of peoples to self-determination at the center of his analysis, whether in Syria, Ukraine, or Nicaragua. His combative, cantankerous, and yet brilliant style kept Marxism true to the principle that the emancipation of the working class can be the work of the working class itself. For Louis Proyect, as for Marx, freedom was not something to be bestowed from above. It was something that existed in the very act of fighting for it. But many sections of the left have forgotten this profound and human point. Many saw murderous dictators like Putin as an antidote to the horrors of American capitalism. Just as their predecessors in Hungary in 1956 saw Soviet tanks crushing workers and students as an advance in the history of human liberation. This mentality was, of course, reflected in the analysis of Syria. Leading figures on the left argued that Assad's war against his people was not the suppression of a revolution, but a fight against Islamic fundamentalism. From pretentious charlatans like Slavoj Žižek to conscientious figures like Noam Chomsky, many believed that the Syrian masses would inevitably fall into the clutches of the most reactionary Islamic fundamentalism. Even when they talked about Assad's atrocities, the narrative never changed. The deaths of hundreds of thousands of Syrians were considered collateral damage, paid to destroy fundamentalism supported by Western imperialism. This is sad because it is the same Israeli narrative that legitimizes the killing of Palestinians in Gaza. They are all terrorists. They are all Hamas. The noble defense of the Palestinians by the international left has never been extended to the Syrians. In my research, I learned that not all of those resisting Assad were fundamentalists. Many were politically secular and had established the first free trade unions in Syria. I also learned that the rebels expelled ISIS from Syria in a fit of rage in 2013. But these facts have been overshadowed by the identification of the rebels with ISIS. From a Leninist perspective, in every major revolution, there are various tendencies and struggles. The task of the international left is to support the truly radical elements and promote these struggles against reactionary elements. In this respect, Syria has unfortunately been left alone. I don't know what will happen now in Syria. I know that HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is an offshoot of Jabhat al-Nusra, which has strong ties to al-Qaeda. It evolved politically from al-Qaeda, but at the same time suppressed al-Qaeda-linked elements, and opened up the possibility of a more pluralistic and secular struggle. Perhaps HTS was pushed to the left by pressure from broader democratic tendencies within the revolution, or maybe it is using it as a cover to establish a religious dictatorship. I don't know, but if the latter is true, isn't the fact that HTS is trying to present itself with a more democratic face to hide its reactionary nature proof that there are still radical and democratic tendencies deep inside the Syrian Revolution? Is it not once again the task of the international left to support and strengthen these tendencies? Instead of simply rejecting them, instead of assuming that Syrian insurgents inevitably turn to religious extremism, the idea that all the protesters in Syria, in a country where so many people have been slaughtered by a government, are doomed to Islamist fundamentalism reflects a racist categorization of Arab backwardness that feeds on the brutal logic of Western imperialism. But the struggle of the radical left must be against precisely these so-called forms of thinking. The fact is that the same leftists who draw attention to Assad's genocidal atrocities, but at the same time claim that those who resist him are just fundamentalists created by Western imperialism, have the same attitude towards Ukraine. They ignore the right to self-determination of the Ukrainian people, fighting against the bloody oppression of Russian imperialism, and see them only as proxies of the West and the US. No matter how much the aristocratic figures of the left like George Galloway or Tariq Ali, or other very important persons, are caught up in their historical greatness and importance, do not believe this narrative. They are selling you a modern version of the Stalinist ideas of their predecessors, who sold Soviet tanks crushing workers and students in Hungary in 1956 as progress. And these people feel that they are far above the peoples they claim to be fighting. Such disbelief is an inevitable consequence because they see themselves in a far superior place, separate from the struggle of those faraway people.